Hey guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I got to talk to Zac, the founder of Data-Driven Strength, a research assistant at the FAU Muscle Lab, with Mike Zodos, who was recently on the show. Many of you will be aware of who Mike is, and Zac's been on my list of someone I wanted to speak to for a while, and there was a rumble in the research area in terms of the impact of estimated proximity to failure and that role towards hypertrophy. And Zac was a big part of that. He was the lead author of a recent published study, which then took a big rumbling across social media, and many people jumped on this. And I really wanted to just dig into it with Zac to explain what their meta-regression was, which is what they were part of, how it was maybe different to some others that have been out there. Not long ago, Martin Refalos from JPS was on the podcast talking about his scoping review of the influence of training to a certain RER and that on hypertrophy, and what were the outcomes and how did they differ to other studies, and what might that mean for us practically when we're trying to get jacked in the gym. And there was just so many back and forths, and I could have spoken to Zac for ages here, and I think there's going to be a lot of value for you guys and a lot to learn. So definitely check it out. And if you did enjoy this, make sure to share it with anyone you think might enjoy it. Do tag us over on social media, let us know, give us a rating or review. If you're on Spotify or something similar where you can do that, that'd be amazing. And of course, if you're over on YouTube, just drop us a comment, give us a like, subscribe, of course, and we appreciate it. It helps the channel grow. Otherwise, let's get into the chat. Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm here today with Zac, the founder of Data-Driven Strength. I'm very excited to talk to him. He's been on my list of someone I wanted to bring on the show for a while, and I was just finding the topic that I wanted to bring him on, and then out of the blue, well, kind of not out of the blue, this paper came out where Zac was the lead author, and I'm very excited for it. He is a research assistant at the FAU Muscle Lab with Mike Zodos, who we literally just had on the show, and we were just talking about Zac, and he was bigging you up and piping you up, and I think people will realize why after this chat here, and I'm very excited to talk to you, Zac, so thank you for being here.
No, thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. Like we were just talking a little bit off air, I'm extremely honored to be here. Been a fan of the show for a long time and excited to discuss things today.
For sure. Yeah. So so people are aware of what the paper was. It was you recently conducted a meta-regression, which a lot of people will be aware of meta-analyses. Probably not meta-regression. I think this is actually the first time I've specifically heard it. And you were looking at the relationship between proximity of failure and muscle hypertrophy, which I think like people on this podcast will be very aware of that topic. We've spoken about it so many times, but this did seem to elucidate something a little bit different to maybe what some people have seen. Some people have kind of potentially jumped the gun on it. And it was potentially a little bit different from some of the stuff that had already come out. But I'd love to hear initially kind of what you did for the paper and maybe what a meta-regression is, so people are somewhat aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to start with the last point there, kind of the difference between like a traditional meta-analysis versus a meta-regression. Fundamentally, they're the same thing, right? What you're doing with a meta-analysis is you're aggregating the findings from individual studies and putting those into kind of a collective analysis to see what does the overall body of research tell us. For kind of a quote unquote traditional meta-analysis, usually what you're doing is you're comparing the results within individual studies, basically. So if I have a training study that compares one group training to failure and the other group training, let's say 3 reps in reserve, I'm going to compare a given outcome between those two groups within that study, and then do that for every study in the analysis, pull those together with some weighting and some other statistical adjustments, and then you're going to get your kind of summary effect size. And that's kind of and you'll see one of those forest plots. People will probably be familiar with that with a lot of meta-analysis. That's kind of what, people probably think of. Really, the only difference with a meta-regression is we're adding in what's called a moderator. And so the moderator is just basically saying when we do this process of looking at the results within the studies that we are collecting, we're going to plot that relationship against this moderator. And there's a few other, little nuanced things that you have to do when you do a meta-regression. One easy example is, like I said, in the first case, we're comparing the outcomes between groups. So that's going to generate an effect size between groups. Whereas with a meta-regression, you're looking at the changes within groups. And so there's some adjustments that you have to do to account for that. Things like that. But ultimately, what a meta-regression allows us to do is to look at the effect of this moderator. One example that the audience probably is familiar with that I know gets a ton of discussion is the meta-regression on protein from Morton and colleagues. Very similar concept there. You're plotting the available data in more of a moderated fashion and looking for some sort of a dose response relationship for the moderator, in that case protein. Our example is RAR. Okay, so with that out of the way, I think there's some really important fundamental things to highlight with our methods. And I think this has probably gone a little bit too under the radar and hasn't really, people haven't grasped onto the nature of what we did enough and understanding the limitations and everything that went into it. So let's discuss kind of the broader proximity to failure research at large. As we know, there's I don't want to be critical of the researchers because it just hasn't really been something that's been focused on or really brought into the research until somewhat recently, about the clarity of set termination, things like that. But for the most part, it's very unclear the proximity to failure sets are terminated throughout the entire body of research, even for studies that say they're training to failure. As you know, Martin Refalos has done a really good job at kind of clarifying these set endpoints in this body of research, particularly for hypertrophy, and that can also influence outcomes. So even when we say somebody's training to failure, that alone isn't a homogeneous thing. And then add that on, non-failure groups, there are a ton of different ways those are described, and trying to understand how far those are from failure, even if they report subjective RAR, let's say, even that could be inaccurate, right? So what we had to do in order to actually perform this analysis is we had to estimate RAR, right? And so there was a series of, and I want to highlight the word subjective procedures, right? We went through how to do this, and I really tried my best to make this as systematic and robust as possible. So we'll go through a few of the things I did to do that. But at the end of the day, somebody could look at our estimation procedures and say, I don't agree with this. And that's totally fair. Like there isn't a right or wrong way to do it, because we fundamentally just don't have the reporting to be confident in those estimations 100%, right? So that's just something that is like highlighted in red pen, like that needs to be understood, that because of the reporting in these studies, we just simply had to estimate RAR with procedures that are ultimately limited. So just as an example, let's say there was a study that has one group that trains to failure, and we'll get to failure definitions in a minute. Let's just take that at face value. And another group that performs with the same load, so let's say 70% of 1RM, but the average repetitions in the failure group was 10 reps per set. The other group, let's say they did double the sets, but half the reps per set. So one group did 3 sets of 10, the other group did 6 sets of 5. An example of an estimation in that case, it's relatively straightforward in this example, is that we basically just took the difference in repetitions. So we have the one group that's training to failure with 10 repetitions per set, the other group that did not train to failure with 5 repetitions per set. So we estimated they were at a 5 RAR. Now, there's a number of assumptions that are already built into that, right? One, we're taking the average RAR, which that doesn't account for a spread in RAR, right? So a 5 RAR estimate could be achieved in a variety of different ways. You could have some really high RAR sets and some really low RAR sets and still end up at that 5 RAR estimate. Another thing is, obviously we know, and there's data even from our lab that demonstrates this, that reps performed at a given percentage of 1RM is extremely individual. So saying that RAR estimate is the same for every single individual in the study is also inaccurate. And so there's just a number of things like this that are clearly outlined in the paper that we had to just make assumptions on. And to be clear, I still do think from like a face validity perspective, when I look at it as a coach or somebody who's been in the gym and tried these protocols out for myself, I think they do a relatively good job of capturing probably what the groups did. Obviously, I wouldn't do something that I wasn't super confident in. But that said, again, I think it's totally reasonable that somebody could look at our estimation procedures and be like, I don't know about this one, and that's totally fine. So that's one thing to take on the front end, and just realize that every time I say proximity to failure from here on out in the conversation, I'm going to try to say estimated proximity to failure, because that's crucial. And so that is an important part of the analysis before we can even get into any of the results or anything like that. That estimation procedure was kind of the permissive step that we needed to even perform this analysis. So with that in mind, there was kind of 5 sub-classifications of studies in the way that we went about estimating them. And so those were all slightly different methods. And we used the best available data that we could to kind of approximate those RAR relationships. The last thing to kind of touch on that I said we'd come back to is the failure definition thing, which is a really, really good point. So when we did this analysis, we kind of did a slightly different approach than a lot of meta-regressions, where basically we fit both linear and nonlinear models. And we did some model comparisons to see which of those seemed to best explain the relationship, right? So a lot of meta-regressions will just stick with a linear approach, as that's generally the simplest and kind of the one that's probably the easiest to get to. One of the approaches that we did, though, specifically did differentiate between failure definition. So as you know, as Martin has been on the show, there's kind of a few different ways you can kind of bucket these failure definitions. Some of them are very, very objectively defined, really, really well laid out, momentary failure, momentary muscular failure, whatever you want to call kind of that section of it. And then there's a few kind of gray area failure definitions that I would say kind of still fall in that category. And that's kind of the way that we ended up doing it. I had a bucket of studies that I considered involuntary set termination, basically, and the other ones that were probably voluntary set termination. So things like momentary failure, concentric failure, anything that provided a definition for what failure was and it wasn't volitional, that was included in one of these models as a failure study. Whereas all the other ones that said they trained to failure, but it was volitional or what have you, or there wasn't a clear definition, it was just considered zero RAR. So one of the models did account for differences in failure definition, although that model was not the one that ended up being the best fit. So that's kind of tucked away in the supplementary materials. We mentioned in the discussion at one point to kind of discuss some of these limitations. But yeah, we did have one model that kind of differentiated between those failure definitions to somewhat account for that. Okay, so got that. And do you have any questions thus far? I'll keep rolling if not, but it's a lot.
No particular questions, but I just want to reiterate that. Like, I had a question of how did you go about estimating RAR, because again, it is everyone who uses RAR at any time is estimating it. Like almost every session I'm doing, I'm estimating an RAR. Like, I can't ever be sure. So I think that's like really well said. But I think your estimation process, it made complete sense. I think outlined that it's like an average is really important, so people are aware that, I mean, I still think it makes it pretty useful and valid as personally. And then I really like your differentiation between like involuntary and voluntary, and then also voluntary being not RAR, because I think a lot of people will say they train to failure, but they actually train to just zero RAR, because I literally just did it today where I did my last set on a leg press, and I was like, I know if I bring that down, there's no way I'm getting that up. Like, I mean, of course, it's me voluntarily ending the set there. So maybe I could have got it up. Like, no one knows. But I would say that's a good point of like zero RAR if someone's voluntarily like stopping the set. So I like that differentiation as well. So no real questions. Just I like all the clarifications, and it's making good sense to me as like a practitioner the way you did that.
Sweet. Yeah. And so kind of when all those stones out of the way, we have the RAR estimations for each study. We have collected all of these different studies, and that's probably another thing to mention, is that kind of the genesis of this project was, we actually wrote an article on Brian Miner's website a while ago. It's been a couple of years at this point, that kind of tried to take all these different areas of research that kind of indirectly look at proximity to failure and kind of combine them all. So in the research, I would say there's kind of four main areas that look at this, whether that's directly or indirectly. So we obviously have the failure versus non-failure research that look at this the most directly. We have the velocity loss studies that definitely are in this area, but I think have some limitations that haven't been totally accounted for in a lot of the analyses. And then we have studies that directly report, subjective RAR or objective RAR in some way. And then we have the alternative set structure research, which I think probably people are a little bit less familiar in your podcast potentially. So the alternative set structure research, I would say, manipulates proximity to failure indirectly. So basically what you have are these two different types of alternative set structures. So you have a group that trains with traditional set structures, which, like I said, 3 sets of 10, 3-minute rest rest between sets, or you have an alternative set structure that basically either redistributes that rest in between repetitions, so that each little cluster or mini set, whatever you want to call it, is farther from failure. Or they add additional rest, which is typically called cluster sets, where the same kind of effect comes into play. So I would say one of the strengths of our approach is that we were able to kind of take all of these areas of research and had a good number of studies to kind of look at this question with kind of more observations, more statistical power, et cetera. So that's probably another thing to keep in mind for this question is those areas have all kind of been analyzed kind of separately to some degree, but we kind of try to combine all those areas with this approach. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind. So then, once we have that, we have the estimate of RIR per study. We got all of our studies, and we're going to actually do the analysis. Like I said, we fit both linear and nonlinear models. So that was something that I think is important to touch on and kind of how model comparisons work. So we reported primarily in the text the results of the best fit model. So from like a statistical perspective, there isn't totally an agreed upon way of like how to determine which one of these models is the best fit. Now there's definitely, best practices, which is what we used to kind of, figure out which of those seems to best explain the relationship. But once again, I think that's another area that, a reasonable person could say, I don't necessarily think this is the best way to compare those models, and maybe I would go with a simpler one. And the reason I bring this up is, something that's gotten a considerable amount of attention on social media has been kind of the relationship towards failure. Now, that seems to be the best fit model given our data set. But, we have a couple other models that, particularly the linear one that just shows a nice gradual relationship up towards failure that wouldn't have such of a capital F failure recommendation, if that makes sense. So there's a little bit of subjectivity that goes with model comparisons as well that I think is important to keep in mind. And if anybody's interested in seeing any of the other models or any of the other estimates, those are all in the supplementary materials linked in the paper as well, because I wanted to make sure practitioners had access to that if they were interested in that. So that, that's something we did. We fit all those models. I think another thing it's important to touch on a few of the things that we adjusted for in the models. So we tried to adjust for the load per set. So we can talk a little bit about that interaction with RIR a little bit. And then we tried to adjust for a few of the things that can kind of influence the magnitude of somebody, a within group change. So one easy kind of question with meta-regression is if I have a study of untrained people and a study of really well-trained people, the within group changes from the untrained people probably are going to be higher purely because of that, unrelated to RIR. So we tried to adjust for some of those common factors to try to make the ability to get the RIR relationship as robust as possible. So with all that out of the way, then we got to the kind of the results there. And I don't know if you want to go straight into that, or we can talk anything more about the methods, but I think that should hopefully outline kind of what we did, the limitations associated with it. And you can tell kind of the way that I'm speaking, it's not a de facto approach, right? Like there are multiple interpretations you could take with this. And there's probably some different ways that you could go about modeling the data as well and come to slightly different conclusions. As we kind of talk about the findings, I'll kind of give my take on the safest interpretation, but ultimately that is kind of what we did. So I don't know if you have any questions to follow that up, Steve.
I don't think I have any questions, but I just wanted to reiterate, first of all, I kind of pigeonholed you into hypertrophy because this also looked at strength. But as the listeners are aware, and as I said to you beforehand, strength is my baby, and that's what most of the listeners are most interested in because there was some differences there. So that's what we'll primarily be talking about. And also the paper itself, I did run and read through it, but it's a beast. Like it's huge. It's a big paper, and it's also got things in there like a lot of what you said there. Unless you are a researcher or a statistician or you're in the field of this, I think a lot of that is like potentially going over people's heads. They don't fully understand it. And I think that's one of the things I just say, like you mentioned, some people have kind of just taken bits. It's like reading an abstract and then just like pasting that over social media and being like, see, I told you. It's like, but you didn't delve into the paper and understand the paper. Like I can read it, but to truly understand all those methods and the lens that you're viewing it at, if you're choosing nonlinear or linear and how that can influence it, that's only something you can get by talking to someone like yourself, because I don't have that base of knowledge, let alone kind of a lot of the people viewing it. So I just want to reiterate that. And I think you did a great job of just elucidating all those little bits that people don't realize go into like science.
Yeah, it's definitely, yeah, it's, I tried to make a comment on, so I did like tried to make a summary post that kind of tried to hopefully limit the amount of misinterpretations that were going to happen with everything. And I tried to make a comment about that, about ultimately, I think it's important to keep in mind, like, science isn't going to give you a prescriptive statement on what to do. A lot of people have said that, but one thing that I like to think about it is like a series of if and then statements. So like, if you have this goal and share these, axiomatic beliefs on how things should be done, then I can give you a prescriptive statement, but I just can't give you the then statement without some sort of if to clarify it. And I think that's very much the case here in terms of, if you agree with our estimation procedures, if you agree the studies that were included, if you agree that the context is appropriate to the training application you're saying, then we can give you results. But it's important to clarify all those ifs before I can give you the then, if that makes sense. And I think that often kind of gets skipped with this kind of stuff. And don't get me wrong, obviously, I think it's a useful analysis still. And I think there's some really interesting things that can come from this and things we can take away from it. It's just important to contextualize those findings and take the degree of uncertainty that comes with analysis like this into it, and not just run away with it and say, like, this is absolutely the best thing since sliced bread. Everybody needs to do exactly this, right? So there's just a couple layers of nuance that are important to take into account. The other thing that just came to mind before we get to the results is, one more thing I want to keep to talk about is, I tried to, the very first graph in the paper kind of is like a visual summary of the training interventions. And I think that's another important thing to kind of contextualize the findings we're going to talk about here in a second, is like, the training interventions aren't particularly super aggressive, right? The one caveat I'll say is that the number of sets per week that I plotted is direct sets and not kind of the total number of sets, if that makes sense, which is a lot of the way that volume is quantified. So that number might seem a little bit deceptively low, but with that in mind, it's still, the frequency by far, the mode was 2 times a week per muscle group. The number of sets, I can't remember what the number is off the top of my head, but I believe it's below 12 sets per week. I think it was 8 if I recall, but I can't totally remember. And then the studies are 8 weeks long in general. And then the typical limitations with the type of participants that we're dealing with, trained, have definitely lifted weights before in a lot of the studies, but not, elite bodybuilders by any means. So again, just another layer of caution that would filter into that if statements of taking all those things into account. It's not like we have a 6-year study with extremely well-trained bodybuilders to base all these conclusions on, right? So it's just another important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like, I don't know, people will always hear, oh, you shouldn't use rat-based research to conclude like human outcomes for things. And it's similar here in that you're saying, like, we looked at this many sets that people were doing. Like, I don't know what would happen if, there was double that many sets, like direct sets per muscle group or what have you. So it's just realizing that, like, this isn't, again, like you said, the be all and end all. It's very useful. It gives us a further clearer picture, which is what science is doing. So yeah, I think that's good clarity. The only thing I think, I don't know if you have a good way of summarizing or suggesting the difference between what you did and Martin. Like, I don't know if there's something that you would say, this is the clear differentiating factor to what we did. Obviously, Martin also looked at some other things that you didn't look at, which I think are important to discuss. But if there's anything there that you could be like, this is, if you're looking at both, this is like the difference.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's another thing I've seen on social media that I just don't totally understand. Like, these analyses should absolutely be viewed synergistically. Like, not only Martin's meta-analysis, but all the meta-analyses that kind of went into this paper. So I believe there's 6, I want to say, that we kind of mention in the methods that we use as kind of our quote unquote inclusion criteria to kind of combine the studies from. So when you're taking an approach like we did, number one, I think the biggest thing is we just have a different number of studies, right? A different number of studies, a different pool of studies, a different inclusion criteria. So thus you're going to have potentially different findings purely based on that. From an analytical approach, I think there's absolutely strengths and weaknesses to both approaches, right? Like, the one thing, I guess, the simplest thing to talk about is when you are making those within study comparisons, you don't have to worry about as much these little confounding variables that occur at the study level. So like study duration, the training status of the participants, the exercise selection, the loads, the volumes, et cetera, because within that study, that's what you're making the comparison between. Whereas when you're doing more of a meta-regression approach, there are those little things that are different between studies that could indirectly influence the within group changes that we're trying to plot this meta-regression against. Now, again, we tried to adjust for as many of those as we could and take into account a lot of those confounding variables, but that's just a quote unquote strength and weakness to each approach, right? I would say Martin's is very, very well directed. He did a great job outlining the different types of failure definitions and has really robust comparisons within each one of those categories, where mine is a little bit more broad. And obviously Martin was an author on this paper, and his insight was really valuable. So a little bit more broad inclusion criteria, and ultimately really trying to isolate the question of what is the dose response relationship with our estimated proximity to failure. There we go. And that's kind of the difference in the approach, right? A versus B, and well, he had a couple themes in his, obviously, but approach A versus approach B, whereas ours is kind of taking all these into the same relationship and trying to really nail down that dose response relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And yeah, it's really interesting to think. I think you outlined it really nicely in terms of how it's the comparisons are different, and it makes sense that you could come to different conclusions, therefore. And I guess you did, because I guess if people were to just read the abstract of Martin's review, it was like failure and non-failure. There was no real difference, like not a significant difference, which obviously he would also say, no, you need to read the paper because there's more clarity to have there. But you found a bit more of a difference than what Martin was finding. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think the first thing to take in mind is, like, I don't know if this is quite as counterintuitive as some people are seeming to suggest. Like I went through the pretty much all the failure meta-analyses a few times to quadruple check this, but pretty much all of the effect sizes have leaned in the direction of the group's training to failure. Now, again, there's limitations to each of those analyses. Martin's is the most recent, and I would say, in my opinion, the most well done. And still, the between group effect sizes within each of the themes still leaned in favor of whatever the closer to failure approach was. It's just the effects were small enough that they weren't considered potentially meaningful based on the width of the confidence intervals, et cetera, context, all the things that I'm sure Martin discussed on his episode. So yeah, I think that's the first thing that's taken into account, is I really don't think these are as counterintuitive as potentially we think. But as you said, maybe the strength of the relationship is something that is potentially counterintuitive for people. Ultimately, I think it really just comes down to that it's a different lens in which we're looking at this from. When you take all those different studies into account, that's really never been done before. So there could just be things that we aren't really seeing until we take this approach and kind of put all these things together. But to summarize the findings broadly, when we kind of look at this best fit model that for hypertrophy, it seems that changes in muscle size tend to increase as you get closer to failure. So there's a lot of little nuances and things to kind of further contextualize that relationship. But the way that I think is like the thing that we can take away semi-confidently from this is that, okay, proximity to failure does seem to matter for hypertrophy, and it's relatively meaningful. That's probably where I would stop the really confident statement. And I really wouldn't go too much farther from there to have a really confident conclusion. First and foremost, for all the different things that we already mentioned from our approach that could be potentially, wrong, like some of the little estimation things. If we could know the RAR estimates of each individual study, we could just be wrong about those, and that could change the way that the model is fit. But given all those assumptions, I would still be pretty cautious with everything, because, like I said, the model comparison approaches, those are still a little bit subjective. You could go with the linear approach that wouldn't suggest as much of an increase. That said, it does seem that not only does gains seem to get better as you get closer to failure, but also when we did that one model that separated between the two different failure definitions, the involuntary set termination did seem to be superior, which again seems to be in line with pretty much all the other meta-analyses. It's just when you see it in this nice long continuous relationship, it could potentially be a little bit counterintuitive. But again, I think the kind of the takeaway conclusion there, for me at least, is that, okay, proximity to failure seems to be pretty meaningful for hypertrophy, but there's a lot of other things that need to be kind of contextualized when we further, go to prescribe training for an individual, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I would roughly describe the results, but I don't know where you want to go from there.
I think you did a great job of that. And if I don't know if this is, you can see if you agree with this. So I think the lens people were looking at RAR before this in terms of like the evidence-based kind of camp, if we can call it that, was kind of like this. Around like a 3 or 4, we start seeing some significant growth, like on average when we're trying to train for hypertrophy. And then from there, we see better growth as we approach failure, but it's not like once you get to like 2 RAR, it's pretty insignificant. Well, it's very insignificant between that and 0 and then failure. But the fatigue side, and that's something different between yours and Martin's. And Martin's paper showed this, like that kind of acute fatigue we experience is exponential, that relationship. But now with your paper coming through, it's kind of like, oh, maybe both sides of that are kind of exponential. So it's a question of, oh, maybe like that, if we could term it stimulus fatigue ratio, it's almost looking like it's staying the same each time that you step up closer to failure. You get a bit more fatigue, but you also get that additional stimulus. And so it's just like equalizing that, where maybe people used to think, or you could say, based off this, I used to think SFR was best at 2, because once you go past 2 RAR, you're just getting more fatigued for not really any additional stimulus. But now it's like, oh, actually going past 2, like if you would just say, I'm going to infinitely train at 2 RAR, maybe you're missing out on like some of this stuff that's past it potentially, depending on all the other programming variables like volume and how that plays into things. Yep. I don't know if that's a fair kind of way about thinking about it.
Yeah, it's oh man, it's so hard. Like the fatigue question is something I struggle with, and I've talked to a few people about this just to kind of bounce ideas off of. So first and foremost, on the fatigue research, pretty much all of it that I'm aware of is acute in nature. And that's really important to keep in mind. So, you bring a group of people into the lab, they do like a crossover design where they do both conditions, and they do one that's pretty close to failure, and they do one that's pretty far from failure. And pretty much always the fatigue is greater than the failure condition. But we really just don't have long-term research on the implications of fatigue of training at a given RAR long-term. And even a training study, I'm not sure if that's going to be enough to like totally really see what we see in the real world. Cause like you just see some of these guys that, really, really take hold of this approach of like taking pretty much every set to failure, past failure, et cetera. They can do it. Like they can do it, and they seem to get pretty good gains. And then the other thing I always keep in mind is like some of these different areas I don't think we think about a ton in terms of like what is truly recoverable. You have people that are like strongman athletes with multi-day events. You have people in team sports that have multiple, training sessions per day, some of which are probably more fatiguing than resistance training. Like you just have all these other populations that have a really, really high workload that probably isn't touching even remotely what we do in the gym, even when you're training with high volumes. And it's just like it makes me wonder really like, what are we capable of adapting to? Now, something you can recover from does not necessarily imply that you can benefit from it, though. That's something that's very important to keep in mind. So I'm not necessarily saying, if you can repeat your performance, that also means that training to failure is good. I don't, that may be a safe assumption, but I'm not prepared to like claim that. The other thing I think is interesting, at least I was really surprised. You had Ben House and Tommy Wood on the podcast recently, and they mentioned
I was going to say about this,
their study, and it doesn't have a comparator group with a farther from failure condition, but the fact that people were able to maintain performance training that close to failure from everything they described, that sounded extremely legit, an extremely intense training session. Man, maybe we're selling ourselves short on a little bit on what does fatigue, how does that change long term? But the other thing I think to keep in mind, and this is a question I just don't think we have an answer to, and it's more of like a philosophical question, is that does performance decrement, which is generally going to be, the most objective marker of fatigue for our purposes, obviously of soreness, perception of fatigue, all those kind of things, does that actually imply that our ability to benefit from something decreases? I don't know if we have anything to suggest that's the case. Obviously, you can make mechanistic speculations like our ability to, achieve high levels of motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension on certain fibers may decrease when we're fatigued. You can make a ton of different speculations on that. But ultimately, the thing that makes me wonder is like, if any of those are truly an issue, we probably would see it in the longitudinal outcomes, and we just don't seem to. So that I do struggle with the fatigue thing, because absolutely the acute data would suggest that training to failure is more fatiguing. And that's, from a coaching perspective, obviously something you want to take into account. It's just, does that necessarily imply that we're not going to benefit from still doing that even when fatigued, if that makes sense. I'm not claiming that it's not either. I just don't know. And I think it's something that's interesting when you kind of take into account all these different populations, like I said, that recover from a lot of stuff, that kind of go past high volume bodybuilding training, if that makes sense. So yeah, a lot of questions there in terms of like how the stimulus to fatigue ratio and all those things kind of play out. Like, I think ultimately the question that everybody wants to know the answer to from this, that I just don't think we can, is, okay, so should I train with high volumes and slightly submaximal proximity to failure, or should I train with lower volumes into failure? Ultimately, I think there's multiple limitations in this analysis that kind of prevent us from making a really descriptive claim there. And fundamentally, I just think we need more original research that looks at that question. Like that, if anybody's looking for, a PhD project or a master's project, this would be the one that I think for this topic is really, really needed. Is I think we probably need to start testing like quote unquote archetypes rather than these volume equated conditions, because I don't really think that's the comparison from an ecological validity perspective that we're interested in. So like, for example, what I'm saying is that, often what we'll have is, one group that's performing 12 sets per week to a 2 or 3 RIR, the other group is performing 12 sets a week to failure. I think the question that's potentially more interesting is if we added a third group and the failure group is also training with, 6 to 8 sets or something like that. There's a few studies here and there that kind of sort of get at that question, like single sets to failure versus multiple sets not to failure. But in terms of like a moderate to high volume approach, comparing those two, I'm not aware of a ton of evidence that looks at that directly, which I think is kind of the next thing, because that'll more directly be able to answer the question of like, which should we prioritize? You could potentially compare like the slopes of RIR from our analysis to the slopes of volume from some of the other volume meta-analyses. But again, for a variety of reasons, I personally wouldn't really do that. I think it just lacks enough direct evidence to confidently make those comparisons. So again, coming back to kind of, okay, what am I taking away from this into the gym? I think it's, again, just that closer proximities to failure seem to meaningfully improve hypertrophy, and that's about as far as I'll take it. Should I prioritize that over volume? Should I always train to failure? Like, all those questions just we can't directly answer those. I think the interesting thing, at least for me, was that when we did the sub-analysis that also looked at the interaction between RIR and the number of sets per week, which again, I want to put a red flag around that, because if you'll notice in the paper, it's adjusted sets per week. One of the things that's a limitation of the way that we quantified proximity to failure in like the alternative set structure groups is we had to kind of treat each one of those mini sets as a set that we estimated proximity to failure from. But when we're quantifying somebody's weekly training volume, maybe that's not as safe of an assumption. So we kind of converted that into a number that's a little bit more reasonable. So for that and other reasons, this adjusted sets per week number, I wouldn't take to the bank as something that's super robust. But nonetheless, when we did look at that, it did seem that higher volumes still led to, better outcomes, and closer proximities to failure still seem to benefit those outcomes at a given volume level. So it's still a question of, okay, ultimately, what am I going to prioritize on the individual level? Am I going to take every set to a 0 to 1 RIR and then just see where I can get with my volume? Or am I going to really try to prioritize my number of sets and then make the RIR fit and support that number of sets? Not entirely sure. And that's probably an individual thing, context dependent, all those questions. So unfortunately, we don't have a really robust answer to that question. But I think the important thing is you can use this as a framework to take your coaching experience and say, okay, we're pretty confident RIR matters a good amount, and taking sets pretty close to failure is probably a good idea on a per set basis. Now, how that plays into how much volume does this individual need? How much is my coaching experience suggests that one factor, benefits another? And is there an archetype of person that may benefit more from one approach than the other? I think all of those are valid coaching observations that can be taken into account and actually utilized when you're writing a program for an individual, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting to me because as a observer within the space, I think coming from like the evidence-based side, and that's why I try and trying to detach my emotions and try and just follow the data in terms of how I train. And it was a case of, right, so volume seems to be like a key driver of hypertrophy. if I sacrifice volume through relative intensity by pushing to 0, 1, like 0 RAR or around failure, that proximity, that might lead to worse outcomes because I sacrifice volume. But there's always this other kind of, I guess it's like volume versus intensity, coming back to that. There's always been this, like, I guess you can put it like Mike Mensa versus like, why have I forgotten his names? The biggest bodybuilder ever, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Why did I forget his name? Arnold versus Mike Mensa. Like, he was kind of the volume guy.
That's a
versus
bodybuilding sin right there, Steve.
Yeah, I know. I just like, where did it go? I could hear his voice in my ear, like, you idiot. We always had these kind of camps, and maybe, but they could switch and they'd see exactly the same results because they're just like, they're getting the stimulus overall is the same. One's just getting it through more volume, the other's getting more intensity. Or like you said, maybe there's this individual difference where one gets better from the other. For me, at least, it's useful because I have seen, or at least as a practitioner, I guess, like you said, you might have clients who just, they prefer training hard. They don't, and we're like, right, actually, if you train harder, yeah, you can't do as much volume. It doesn't seem to be as much of an issue as we thought. We kind of make up for that volume through intensity now. So it's nice that I kind of feel like I have maybe a bit more of in some ways it's nice, in some ways it's not, because it felt like, we had this kind of direction we were going with this balance between volume and intensity. This is probably going to lead to the best stimulus and growth overall. Now it's like, actually, there's so many roads to Rome again. It's like opened up the field. But again, it's quite nice because that matches what I see anecdotally, where there are people seeing great results who are training super hard all the time, but not doing that much. And then again, there are people doing it on the other side, and both camps will bring up big bodybuilders, big names. And it's like, well, like your paper seems to have kind of brought us back to accepting that that's something that is real.
Yeah, if I take my researcher hat off for a second, and this is purely my opinion now, kind of putting this into like practical application, I think ultimately the optimization problem for a coach that you're trying to solve here is that we are trying to fit this amount of like this volume, proximity to failure combination to maximize that for an individual. And so I think if I'm just looking at this from like a purely like logical probability perspective, you're probably not maxing out either of them. Like that just doesn't seem to make sense to me. Like, let's take every single set to failure, past failure, every single one of them. The meta-analysis suggests that, right? Let's do, 2 sets per muscle group per week and just absolutely bury ourselves on each of those sets twice per week, right? 1 set per session. I think that's probably not smart. And then, taking a bunch of sets to 3, 4 RAR and trying to accumulate 30 sets per week because you can do that now and recover from it, probably also isn't ideal for most people. Obviously, cases apply. If somebody's not looking to absolutely optimize muscle growth, the former approach could be absolutely viable. So I'm just talking about in the frame of somebody who's like absolutely after optimal results. Yeah, I view it much more like an optimization problem that probably is like slightly different on the individual level. For example, I'm sure you can agree with this, Steve. Like, I've had clients that are definitely more sensitive for injury's sake, fatigue's sake to RAR than they are, number of sets, and vice versa. So I think the optimization problem there can change depending on individual sensitivities and also the psychological approach to failure. Like, some people can take a set to failure with a pin drop in the gym and it's all internal arousal and it's, could still be fatiguing for that reason, but not to the same degree of, somebody that's throwing chalk in the air and ammonia sniffing on the hack squat. Like, there's very different approaches to what that means to an individual, which I think is ultimately going to have pretty meaningful implications on how you actually apply it. But I do think that is ultimately kind of where I've landed on this, is like, there's this optimization problem that you're trying to solve. When it was initially the volume research, everybody's like, all right, let's do 40 sets per week. Like, that's the way, high volume is the way to go. A Schoenfeld study comes out and they're like, oh, absolutely, it's the high way to go. And I think the same thing with this is people are like, okay, training to failure is the way to go. The high volumes are stupid. Like, I don't think that's the case. Like, in my opinion, what it's kind of done for me is, we have this range of RAR that we think is really, really productive training. And you said it earlier, the kind of stimulus fatigue ratio thing, that probably was a little bit farther from failure for me than it is now. And I think that's another interesting thing that I don't know a ton of people may not realize, is like, Dr. Zordis and I have talked about this a few times. Like, this changed my mind. Like, this is not what I expected to find going into this. I would have definitely expected more of like a, 3 RAR to failure is essentially the same. And I think kind of regardless of the modeling approach, it does seem that, at a given amount of volume and a given load, it does seem to improve the closer you get to failure when we kind of take this approach. Again, not to say that's the end all be all, but this did somewhat kind of surprise me when we did the analysis. So for me, what it's really done is it's just taken that general range of productive training for hypertrophy and just kind of scooted it down a little bit. I'm not taking every set to failure. It's not completely flipping my mindset on how this stuff works. Like, we know productive training can occur at 2, 3 RIR, even 4 RIR, especially when we get into heavier loads, which I'm sure we'll touch on. So yeah, I think that's kind of the way that I frame it, is just like, maybe instead of that 2 to 4 RIR range, maybe I have scooted it down to like that 0 to 2 to kind of live in that range most of the time. And maybe on, some of the less fatiguing exercises, which again, there's a lot of question marks around the fatigue thing, in my opinion, but nonetheless, from experience sake, like, that's absolutely a consideration, right? Maybe I'm not taking those to failure, but I'm making damn sure it's 1 RIR kind of thing, if that makes sense. And I think that's really as far as it needs to go. Like, I don't think there needs to be this dogmatic statement of how you have to do it, because I genuinely think, like you said, there is multiple roads to Rome here. You could perform considerably higher set volumes and probably benefit from that at a submaximal RIR, or you could take an approach where you're taking every set very, very close to failure and do some lower training volumes to reach the same absolute outcomes. All we're saying is that at a given amount of, at a given load and a given number of sets, it seems that if you were to compare one group versus this group, training closer to failure seems to be a little bit better for hypertrophy. But the last thing I think is important to keep in mind is this another thing I tried to clarify in my post. I don't know if it really sunk in, is like, there's an effect size or a difference that's going to justify an intervention for somebody that's different for every single person. And I think this comes back to the context of, like, are you trying to optimize hypertrophy? What's the overall context here? But if the difference between the conditions doesn't meet that threshold for somebody, the quote unquote right thing to do may be very different than from somebody else's perspective. So there's kind of these subjective layers that get added on to that if statement I talked about earlier that also need to kind of play into this. Like, okay, with 0 RIR is better, let's say about 1%. Does that really matter in the grand scheme of things and all these other contexts? And you may personally have sensitivities to training to failure. Maybe there's some psychological, fear of that. And maybe it's not your preference. Like, there's all these things that could kind of layer onto that, why that 1% difference isn't really justified to you. So I think that's also important to keep in mind, is that there's this subjective layer of interpretation. Like, just because the line's higher doesn't automatically mean that's what you should do, if that makes sense. But I think that's often kind of the interpretation at face value. So
yeah, we know you're going to grow if you train hard. That should come as no surprise. And then it's like, this is us nerds really nerding into like the weeds a little bit here. And I wonder with some of these things where it kind of, if you somewhat auto-regulate yourself out, it kind of ends in a wash, where it's like that person who's leaving a bit more in the tank, they can recover from more, they do more, they get kind of that volume they get the hypertrophy they're missing out on from the intensity through volume, and then the other person, they can't do as much, and so, but they're training harder and closer to failure. A question actually I did have, because I don't know I guess I was surprised to see this, because I guess that's because it was kind of set volume matched, I guess is where I'm coming from, but it was the involuntary failure was superior to voluntary failure, where I've got a bias of where I think maybe that difference came from, is because the people who are involuntary stopping their sets actually had much more in the tank than they necessarily thought they had. And so I wonder if, like, for a more well-trained lifter who knows what failure is, the difference between kind of doing that final rep, real grind, and then coming down and like getting this like 20% partial or something, and the fatigue that would generate. So that's where my volume idea kind of piece comes in, where it just ruins the next set. I wonder if that's where you're thinking that is as well, where, like, again, I actually saw a post where someone was like, no, you always have to go to momentary muscular failure if you want to maximize hypertrophy. It's like, well, actually, maybe as a newbie who doesn't know failure and they want the most for hypertrophy from one set, maybe, but I'm not sure anyone else should.
No, that absolutely is exactly my thinking. I don't necessarily think that failing a repetition is required, nor optimizes things per se. It's almost certainly just that the volitional failure conditions aren't actually 0 RIR. And that's what we mentioned in the discussion section of probably what's happening there is more so that. So Yeah, I from a practitioner's perspective, I just don't really think there's probably a benefit to actually failing a repetition. Now, when we look at Martin's analysis that does a really good job of separating that, it does still seem to lean in favor of momentary failure. I can't recall now if they did a comparison between set failure and momentary failure. That's going to slip my mind, but theoretically, I did answer that question if they did an analysis for that. But once again, I think it's probably just because that condition that's failing actually is in that 0 to 2 RAR window rather than the other conditions that are kind of a little bit more fuzzy, right? Like we all know that you could get to a point where you're like, 3-4 RAR and certain exercises like leg extension, for example, and or leg press, like depending on the model of the leg press, and probably pump out considerably more. And so that's probably what's going on there. If I had to guess, I can't say with confidence, obviously. But I guess if you make me put my cards on the table, I'm probably not advocating for people to fail very often. It's just I want you to get to that true window of 0 to 2 RAR or whatever. And I think that's where, if I had to, again, researcher hat off, coach hat on, that's the benefit of consistent exposures to failure, in my opinion, almost entirely, is like it's going to be that compass of making sure that are actually in that 0 to 2 RAR range. Now, would I go to failure a little bit more often after looking at this than I would have beforehand? Probably. But I still think it's the predominant benefit there is just because the training that you're performing is going to be actually in that range, and we're very confident about that. The other thing I was going to say in terms of kind of this optimization problem is like the if we kind of take away the volume part of it for a second and we just look at the RAR part of it, I think from like, okay, when we're going to program for somebody, I think the important thing to keep in mind is we're not necessarily trying to just do one set to failure and then all these other sets have to compensate for that. Like the thing we would probably want to optimize is the total training stress that's accumulated in this very close to failure window. And so the reason I specify that is because here's an example. You take a set to failure on a hack squat for a high repetition target, like 15, let's say. The next set you do, even if that's on your logbook that the next set's supposed to be 0 RAR, we know there are tons of factors that go into your actual ability to tolerate that discomfort and actually reach failure in that next set. So even if you're somebody like you who knows what failure is, you have tons of experience doing it, and myself as well, like if you set yourself up for that on paper, like the likelihood that second set is truly within that 0 to 2 RAR window, I'd say the probability is much lower. So I think it's probably more helpful to think about it that way in terms of, okay, regular exposures to failure is probably important because it gives me an anchor to make sure, damn sure I'm in that window. Would I do that more frequently than I probably would have said prior to this analysis? Yes. However, within that range, and again, this comes back to the just analyzing the average RAR estimate as opposed to the spread. There's probably different ways you can program that to make sure that the training stress within that RAR window is actually maxed out, as opposed to if I take every single set to failure, even though those later sets to failure feel like they're 0 RAR, there's no guarantee that they actually are, and our ability to tolerate that discomfort probably decreases set to set, and session to session, et cetera. So now, am I saying take every set to 1 RAR, 2 RAR? Also, no. I don't know. I'm just saying that that's a consideration to keep in mind. And probably from the RAR side of things, that's probably the optimization problem that we're dealing with is like, okay, and that's probably is individual, exercise dependent, load dependent, all those things. But if we can try to isolate and maximize the amount of training stress that's accumulated in this window, that's probably what we want to do. And then the number of sets further modifies that. So yeah, that was really the thing that kind of made it click for me when I kind of really internalized the results and like how this jives with my personal experience and coaching experience. And I think that makes sense to me and kind of, I think is a pretty practical way to go about it of thinking, okay, now that I've got a number of sets, exercises, things like that. Okay, what in this exercise in this session is going to maximize the amount of work that I can get in that RAR range, and how can I go about programming that? That's kind of the way that I would I would probably think about it. And then, of course, there's adjustments that need to be made based on performance trends and how fatigued the client is, et cetera. But I think to get you started, I think that's a pretty practical way to think about it, and probably how I would recommend it based on what we found.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We created the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, I really like that. I have a few points. One is just as I think I said this with Pascal in the improvement season we just recorded, where I was like, if you were to take the most, like the most literal kind of outcome from this paper, you just take the abstract, then you could equally say, well, a deadlift off the floor, biggest kind of raw stimulus magnitude, just do that all the way to failure, you're going to get the best gains. And everyone knows, especially as you're strong, like that just, you can't do anything else after you've taken like a deadlift set to failure. You maybe can do some calves and biceps or something, but there's not much going on. And so people don't recommend that because they're like, oh, the fatigue side just wipes you, which I think is really important to kind of visualize. And then I just wanted to clarify with momentary muscular failure that you're talking about, that includes technical failure, and correct? Like people aren't just like moving A to B, they are including like it's good technique. I know Martin included that in his, but I wanted to check for you.
I'm not going to say that confidently just because the definitions of the study provided, usually it's not, I think I can think of one study that says within the technical parameters of the exercise, but pretty much all the other ones are just, they're unable to complete the concentric portion of the repetition or through the full range of motion or whatever the language is. I would say I probably agree with that definition, but the exercises that are the cleanest to think about failure definitions are machines, right? Like that's very cut, straightforward. It's when we get to, free weight exercises, like things like a back squat, and that's where it starts getting a little bit messier. Like the best squat set of my life, I did like 407 for 10 on back squats, and that was definitely not a quad dominant movement at the end of that set, right? Like that's so like, did I fail that for a specific execution much earlier in that set? Potentially, and that is definitely going to have implications. And I guess that's something that kind of rolls into one of the other limitations that I haven't touched on yet, is like specifically for hypertrophy. We just really don't have a ton of data on regional and synergistic hypertrophy. So using the example of a free weight squat, if you only measure quad hypertrophy, for example, in a study that does back squats, it could be that as we fatigue, you hit that point of technical failure, right? And you're just distributing the loading demands in a different spot. So that additional stimulus that you're getting as you get closer to failure is just distributed elsewhere that's not measured on an ultrasound scan. Could be the glutes, could be the lower back, could be the hamstrings, whatever it is. And so that's just not conceptualized in our current analysis. From the few studies that we have, I would say that it really doesn't change things because training closer to failure probably is going to be better for those. Conceptually, that kind of makes sense, right? If you're totally fatiguing the system, that's probably going to, kind of get all the little different components. But that's just a limitation. And another thing to keep in mind is like that's something we just don't have a ton of data on. But yeah, I think ultimately the exercise selection component, the load component, all those different things definitely from a practitioner's perspective play a role, even if we're not able to, tease that out really neatly from an analysis perspective. So yeah, that's a very good point, and not advocating for 5 RM deadlifts for to get jacked for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I think even you mentioned the study that I was talking to with Ben House in terms of their recovery, and I think I don't know. I don't think they standardized for tempo or something. Like I remember that discussion coming up where maybe their set length actually got shorter. So it's like, well, did they repeat performance, or actually have they somehow changed the exercise? Like people could be doing, say, like zero failure training, but they've now, like people easily know, like cutting range of motion, things like this. But if you're not taking into consideration like a technical failure and like finding a point there, or like tempo and standardizing that, I don't know if it's a bad thing, but you could be getting into some like, I mean, it's hard training, but how much of it is hard for the muscle you're trying to actually attack, and how much of it is just like completely trashing you?
100%. Like that, it's a great point. And I think kind of coming back to that principle that hopefully is the easiest thing to kind of take into actually your program is like that little range of training stress that we're trying to optimize for, like take that a step further. That is for a specific muscle group. So put on all those, things of caution we already mentioned. If I'm training 0 to RIR in certain exercises, that maybe isn't going to deliver an additional stimulus depending on how you're defining failure, right? So it just, there's more nuances here, and it just all really depends. That's why I like to come back to really just the fundamental relationship, and kind of using that as the thing that which we can kind of use as a jumping off point for all the little nuances and things that we know play a role from our practical experience. Like it seems like training closer to failure meaningfully benefits hypertrophy, but to actually apply that and contextualize that, there's all these little different things that go into actually writing a program. And I think that, again, that window of optimizing the training stress there, the exercise selection, the definition of failure, technical failure versus momentary failure in the gym on certain exercises, you might favor one definition versus the other. Does that influence how close to failure you're taking that exercise? Like there's just so many little pieces of nuance that are going to kind of go on to that. And I think that's an excellent one that's definitely important to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah, it's so interesting actually talking about this. Like I feel like a proper bodybuilding nerd kind of talking about it at this in depth, but it's great talking to you.
You have really, really good points, and
I appreciate it.
The pacing, the exercise, the set pacing is a really good one, because that kind of alters the task by the descent speed and time between repetitions and stuff like that. And definitely a lot of studies are not reporting how many breaths they get between reps and everything, right? So like there's a lot of stuff that is just kind of, we shrug our shoulders and say it's the best we got. And that's why, as always, like we use this as a framework to make decisions rather than the thing that it's more like a map than it is a set of instructions, right? The map allows you multiple routes to get to a destination, whereas a set of instructions is going to tell you exactly what to do. Research is never going to be that instruction booklet unless you share literally all the if statements that go into the then statement. Is that ever going to happen? Almost certainly not, unless you're a robot or something like that. With AI, who knows where we're going? But that's kind of the way that I see it. Is that it's really more of like that jumping off point, that map that gives you multiple directions to attack a given problem, rather than saying this is what to do in every single case, right?
Yeah, I think something I also wanted to touch on was we've kind of talked about kind of non-failure and failure a little bit like dichotomously, but you've brought up points here where you're like, you actually, within a session, you don't have to take every exercise to the same RAR. There can be reasons to leave more in the tank maybe at the start of the session. This was something Martin was talking about, where this neuromuscular fatigue, and we've kind of touched on it here, if you go all out at the start of the session, the end of the session, probably not that super stimulative, but if you kind of hold yourself back at the start and then make things harder, and then like you can apply that to a workout, maybe a mesocycle. Some people, I think that's my general approach, is like apply that to a workout, apply it to a mesocycle as a whole. It's just, as you mentioned, maybe we shift that focus of intensity a little bit higher. And then I even think about, like you said, there's individual differences. I'm not one of these people, and I kind of I wish I was, but people who do like hip hinges, and if they go to failure on a hip hinge, they're sore for like 2 weeks or something for like one set. Whereas I know for me, it's not the case. But if that person was just to take this at face value and they start again doing their hip hinges there, that's just not going to be great for them. But I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Zac. I was just thinking about, as an example, my calves. Calves are one of those muscle groups, I think, for a lot of people, like to get my calves sore, I don't know what I have to do. Not train them for like a year and then like obliterate them in a session and then they get some soreness. Otherwise, they seem to recover very quickly. Calf training isn't very taxing, maybe just psychologically a bit tough. And I wonder if just consistently training those a bit closer to failure, because their volume tolerance is so damn high, or at least for me, like that's a case where I'm like, maybe actually I'll just touch them a bit closer to failure Whereas if I was training that close to failure for maybe that person who has hamstrings, like that doesn't make sense for them. They're better off playing further away, and maybe they need another set there, but they're not going to get that same amount of damage. I don't know if that's something that you've thought about as well, or seen with you in your training or your clients as well.
Yeah, 100%. Like that to me is a perfect way to kind of elucidate the differential solutions you can come to that optimization problem, right? Like in the example of your cast, you're basically saying, all right, to get the requisite amount of training stress, I'm going to have to do an absurd number of sets. How can I increase the training stimulus per set and potentially make things a little bit more efficient? Max out the RAR lever, right? That makes perfect sense to me. And then in the alternative case, again, trying to optimize that training stress within that window. If we do that for a hip hinge or something like that for this individual, I can be wrecked for like, a week maybe. It's funny because Josh, one of the co-authors on this paper, we have a leg curl machine that you can kind of alter where it's the most challenging. When the long muscle length research started coming out, particularly the Mayo study with the seated leg curl, we loaded that bad boy up and made it super stretched, and it's just crazy to see the difference. Like I could do leg curls the next day just by doing them to like absolute like bone crushing failure, whereas he's like still limping 6 days later or something like that. So there's absolutely like individual fatigue differences and stuff like that, but ultimately it just comes back to that optimization problem is different there in that case due to the consequences. And I think it perfectly maps onto the session, the mesocycle, all those things. It just, for me, really the only thing that it does, like that optimization problem really has never changed. Like volume has never definitely been more important than the quality of every set, or vice versa. They're both very important, and you can't max out one and still optimize everything probably. Like you need to have this quote unquote balance. And really the only thing that's done for me is I probably just value a little bit closer to failure. So that optimization problem is just occurring in a slightly different window. But that doesn't mean that it's every single exercise context individual. It's in the same place. Like it could be for that individual on the hip hinges, it could have been, 4 to 5 RAR on those hip hinges, let's say. And then maybe this evidence is like, let's try 3 to 4, like that kind of thing, right? Like, yeah. I think it's just valuing that as like a conceptual thing that probably for most people, when we, take the law of averages into account, assuming most people respond in a similar way, that's going to probably budge us slightly more in that direction. But as you said, that absolutely does not mean that every single session, mesocycle, week within that mesocycle needs to be homogeneous. And you can definitely, periodize those things if you find that to be an effective approach. Some people like to keep things more static. Like there's a lot of different ways to go about reaching that conceptually. And it's just going to come down to like, for whatever reason it is, ultimately, like the fatigue stuff, I have a lot of questions on like if that's the why. But I guess for me, I still think about it from the perspective of like, okay, if you do a set to failure, and regardless whether it's neuromuscular fatigue, central fatigue, peripheral fatigue, your arousal is going to decrease meaningfully. Maybe your motivation is going to go down the toilet after that. Like there's a ton of different reasons why the next set could be potentially less productive if you continue that pattern. I don't really know why, but it seems to me that the practical point of it is that, okay, there's implications of taking a set to a given proximity to failure. Let's optimize around that within a exercise, session, week, mesocycle, et cetera. And that's going to lead to different approaches depending on the context, right? So that is 100% a valid approach, I think. And I think reasonable people can come to very different conclusions on what that is going to mean for a given individual and a given context, goal, et cetera. So yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And ultimately, again, really the only thing that changes from that as a coach, because you already do that, is just maybe just bumping down the conceptual starting point of where we're starting that optimization problem from, maybe just a little bit closer to failure, is really the way that I would conceptualize that.
No, I completely see that. It's something I've thought about before is when I used to, I found myself in this like volume trap, I would call it, where I would start my mesocycles out at what I would conceive as like a 3 or 4 RAR. And I'd be like, I'm recovering from this fine. Let's add some sets in here. And I'd end up having so much quantity. I think my quality of just work, my intensity, I just, like when you've got so much to do, you can't do everything to your best ability. And so I just found I was too far swung that other way. I definitely didn't get the best results that way. And as I've learned, like, okay, actually on a leg press, like it's 3 or 4 RL is fucking hard, like let alone like the rest of it. So like when I got that better for myself, and now even now with, like you said, with this coming out, it's like, okay, let's put on that intensity lever a bit more. And that's going to consequently mean I need less volume. I'm not going to be able to recover from as much. And actually that's I think a really good thing, because I think, yeah, whenever, and you kind of mentioned with, if you start out just everything all the way to failure, that's going to have knock-on consequences down here. Like if you swing too far, essentially in one direction, it's not going to lead to the best outcomes. You might be able to make up for it through other means to some extent, but somewhere in this middle zone. And that middle zone's just shifted a little bit for like the evidence-based lifter, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Like, again, we don't know this with perfect confidence, but this is, I guess, the implication you're dealing with is like, once again, if you take our analysis as something you take seriously and kind of agree with the approach that we took, you probably would agree with the conclusion that, like, you know, a lot of people have said like 2 RAR and failure are like 100% equivalent. That doesn't seem to be what we've found, kind of regardless of the modeling technique that we utilize. And so if you agree with that, then ultimately all that really does is just say, okay, I'm not going to use the range and the hard cap that I'm using at the top of it is 2 RAR because I'm using that as equivalent to 0. It just means that we're shifting it slightly closer to failure, which is going to have a few knock-on implications to the way that you're kind of, you know, boiling everything down. But yeah, you're spot on. It's definitely something that has so many layers to it that, you know, anybody that says there's just a static recommendation, this is what you should do for any set, I just don't think has taken into account the numerous limitations and things we just don't know about this research that ultimately make us go from, you know, conceptual principles and things that we can start from to actually applying this on an individual level. And I think you see that from anecdotes too, right? Like, you know, tons of people have gotten jacked in kind of both archetypal approaches, right? I still think that's going to be a really cool study to do. So if somebody's interested, please do it. I think that'd be awesome to kind of, you know, maybe like a within subject design. One arm's doing the kind of the lower volume, closer to failure approach, where the other one is kind of doing the higher volume, slightly more submaximal approach, and just probably, if I had to guess, more than one road leads to Rome there, if they're kind of, you know, conceptually dosed in a similar way, which is kind of a hard, it'd be a hard way to kind of do that, right? Like, would the failure group do half the sets? Would they do 3/4 the sets? We don't really know. That's kind of a hard question to think about, but ultimately I strongly suspect there's multiple roads to Rome here. It's just a matter of, okay, what's the bottom end of the RAR recommendation that can get us there? And then what's the necessary top end? Both of those questions we don't have answers to, but there's probably, you know, something there that can do that. And then again, you just layer on all the other training variables on top of it. I guess the one thing we haven't touched on in terms of training variables yet is the interaction with load. So I think one thing that I've noticed a lot of people have kind of brought up is you kind of touched on it earlier with the deadlifts. I think a lot of times when people think about exercise differences, a hidden premise or like an implicit assumption there is that often those come with heavier loads. And I think that's kind of picked up in our analysis here. So there was, you know, from standard statistical terms, or like a meaningful or significant interaction between RAR and load, meaning that the relationship between estimated proximity to failure and changes in muscle size seem to depend on the load that you used. And I think the most interesting thing is that as loads increased roughly, just an approximation, above like an 8 RM or so, definitely above like a 5 RM or so, it doesn't seem to matter nearly as much as like those moderate loads to low loads. So basically, once you kind of get out the lower end of the hypertrophy rep range, once you're kind of, I think the lowest I've seen like kind of most people go is like that 4 to 6, depending on an exercise. Once you're kind of there, like 4 RAR for a set of 4, 8 RM there, that's probably fine, basically is what that's saying. What exercises are you doing 4 reps on per set, probably your free weight movements that are people are like, dude, failure on a back squat, what the heck are you talking about? Like, that's probably where that gets picked up. So I think, obviously you could do hack squats for sets of 25 if you want to. I just think that's probably a bit less standard. And that's not really that's not where that anecdote comes from. I think it's more so that those big hitter exercises, your bench presses, your squats, your deadlifts, your barbell rows, your shoulder presses, things like that, more often than not, you're probably, if you're getting there with any exercises, you're getting in that heavy enough loading range where the RAR probably isn't nearly as big of a determinant of the changes in muscle size that you'll get. And so I think that's another kind of important piece to keep in mind is like, if you are somebody that, likes to hit a couple sets of 5 or 6 on a back squat, the relationship's not the same there. Like, you probably are totally fine keeping that 2-3 reps in the tank. And so our window where that optimization can occur can probably stay where it was, and doesn't really need that additional, kick in terms of proximity to failure to make that set the absolute most, optimal or whatever you want to call it. So I think that's probably going to address a lot of the concerns about the exercise selection thing from this, that I think people don't realize how interrelated those things are, right? Like, people just aren't doing sets of 15 to a 2 RAR on squats usually. You can obviously, but that's probably going to correlate much more strongly with those are the exercises I'm doing heavy loads with. And those are the exercises when you tell me training to failure seems to be beneficial in some cases, that, man, you're crazy. No, it's not. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
It's so interesting because this again comes back to this kind of thought of like there's many roads to Rome, because I have critiqued power building before for like optimizing hypertrophy, but conceptually, if we consider this, like as long as you're not taking those sets to failure, the SFR actually could be fairly decent for like a heavy set of 5 on a bench if you leave maybe 3 reps in the tank. That fatigue cost might be very similar to taking, and the stimulus cost might be very similar to like a bench press, like a machine press to like 2 RAR for a set of 10. It's kind of like, where I've theorized, because people talk about, I know Mike has called maximal adaptive volume as like that's where you're growing your best. In the last couple of years, and I talked to Jake Reed from Renaissance Periodization. He's actually a client of mine. We were kind of talking about it where it's like max recoverable stimulus, and stimulus is so like arbitrary, like what is that? But like there's just so many roads to stimulus, and it's like just managing that fatigue and stimulus side. It's just really interesting because again, it comes back to the anecdotes of, again, really successful power builders. Maybe they are just doing like a triple to like and they're not taking it to an RPE 10, they're taking it to an RPE 8, and it doesn't ruin the rest of their session actually, and it can be a very productive part of it. I'm not saying I'm going to start doing that, but again, it comes back as a coaching tool, as like a preference thing. If you've got a client that loves to do these things, it's like, actually, we can program that into an optimal, like quote unquote, optimal setup for you for hypertrophy, which is quite cool.
100%. Yeah, I think that's definitely important to keep in mind. I'm not super familiar with the research that kind of, so you hear people throw out the 5 to 6 reps per set thing as kind of the bottom end of the rep range that we can count a set. Have a few problems with that in general. Like, 1, what's the sufficient proximity to failure that we're counting a set? 2, I don't think that's super robust, like in terms of the way that's been tested. So I use that as like kind of a rough cutoff because conceptually it seems to make sense, but like that is a question that I would use for that implementation, is like there's probably like a low number of reps per set that we don't want to cross. And so it's probably fine if you're on that upper end of things. I would imagine like a set of 6 at a 2 RAR is probably fine. So yeah, if a client wants to implement some of those more kind of traditional strength exercises, and I think, in fact, keeping it a little bit more submaximal in terms of the proximity to failure for particularly free weight movements is probably more productive for the muscles you're trying to train. Like if we assume, again, researcher hat off, coach hat on, things like the triceps and the hip extensors are going to get more work as we get closer to failure and kind of distribute the loading demands differently in that exercise. Maybe keeping a couple reps in the tank is actually more efficient on a per set basis for the muscle groups that, from a hypertrophy perspective, you're probably programming the bench press for, if that makes sense. Yeah. So I think it's kind of comes together there nicely in terms of, if somebody wants to do this, our main goal is hypertrophy, they kind of want to train heavy, Yeah, let's go in this kind of, moderate rep range, keep a couple reps in the tank. I think that kind of ties together nicely, but it does seem like there's probably some low end of the rep range that quote unquote optimizes things per set. But just like we've talked about for the last hour, that too is probably subject to all these different things that you got to keep in mind. Like, the way you feel after a set to failure of 20 on hack squat is very different than a set to 6 to 8, right? So all those things need to be contextualized further, but ultimately, if a client has a preference for that, I think there are ways you can integrate that successfully with these principles in mind, for sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It almost puts to question, depending on how low of reps like we decided was okay. It's like that because people have conceptualized like the effective reps model. It's like, well, if you're able to leave, like, I don't know, if you're at an RPE or leaving so many in the tank that like you're not even getting like many effective reps, but you're actually getting and stimulating hypertrophy really well, it puts into question that kind of thought process and concept. I know people have questioned that too. I know Brad was critical with it. I just did an interview with him and he's kind of like, I don't think all the reps leading up to that are just like completely wasted. He thinks there's maybe something there. It's kind of absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence in that sense. And yeah, it's just opening everything up. I don't know if there's anything else I particularly have to ask you about. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to cover in this, Zac, or...
I mean, honestly, I think that's the main thing is like we've hammered on it for like the last, however long we've been talking. Like this analysis, obviously I'm biased, but I think it does a really good job in kind of helping us take steps forward to understanding the dose response relationship between estimated proximity to failure and a variety of training outcomes. But as we kind of talked at the top of the show, like it's really important to take into account all of those, limitations and things that went into the analysis that are pretty atypical and not standard, but were required for us to be able to actually examine this question. So I think, the takeaway, like we talked about a few times, is that, training close to failure probably matters for hypertrophy a decent amount. And maybe our recommendations slip slightly down towards, the closer to failure end of the spectrum, but using that as a de facto prescription in literally every case, application, context, and like we talked about, the subjective goals that are important to keep in mind for that too, is all really, really important. So don't just run with things just because the estimate is higher and automatically assume that's the end all be all in all applications. That's supposed to be the way that you train. I definitely don't view things that way. And I think it's important to take all that context into account when you're looking to, dive into this. And there's other things that we could talk about, like the frequency, the volume of the training interventions, like we mentioned. Like we haven't explored, the volumes and the frequencies that some people use nearly as much in this body of research. So there's just limitations to what we can be confident about. And I wouldn't just take these relationships to the bank and be 100% confident in them, because we could get, the next 5 years, we could get a ton of research that is really, really well reported in terms of the RIRs that participants were training to, and it could prove all of our estimations like pretty inaccurate. And then we could come back and do this again and realize that, hey, the relationship's pretty different than what we estimated. Now, does this seem to fit with experience to a good degree? And am I relatively confident in our estimation process? Yeah, I am. But it's good just to always take that humility pill and realize we did the best we could, but that doesn't mean it's the perfect analysis, right? That's just not possible with the tools that we have. And that degree of uncertainty always just needs to be painted in the weight of or the strength in which you make a claim about this topic. So yeah.
I think that's really well said. A question I did add, if you've still got time, I just looked through my notes. There's a question. It was kind of talking about, well, obviously with the relationship you showed with proximity to failure, some people might argue then, like, and I mean, these are great arguments, I think, just generally, like if something is very non-specific, very technical, like it's not a great, like an Olympic lift generally isn't going to be a great hypertrophy tool because it's not really taking any specific area close to failure. Yep. So some people might take that and be like, and I think some people have said like a more stable specific exercise, like a hack squat maybe versus like a barbell back squat is going to be superior for hypertrophy. Do you think, and I guess some people have like argued machines may be better than like free weights because of the stability component, you can really tax muscle. Do you think your study could provide support for that argument, but it would be closed-minded to just run with that and that there are other factors involved with hypertrophy that wouldn't be taken into consideration when you're just looking at that?
I hadn't thought about that one. It's a good question. So I'm going to answer it in an if statement again, because that's the only way I can do it without, hating myself as soon as we hang up. If those machine-based exercises, more stable conditions, etc., allow you to reach a truer proximity to failure of the muscle, I think one could somewhat reasonably conclude that that could be beneficial. Now, is that the case for every single person, every single exercise, every single muscle group? I don't think so. Like the example that I think of immediately is like squatting. So, a pendulum squat or a leg press or a hack squat, like obviously you can't really move out of those. Like the fatigue accumulates, your quads are going to fail. That's just what's going to happen. Now, when I squat, particularly low bar, get close to failure, that kind of thing, like it's not quad movement after the first couple of reps, right? So like I think for me, maybe that's the case. And is that the stability component, or is that the limiting the degrees of freedom? I don't know. Like maybe they're saying that those are the same thing. I'm not entirely sure, but I've also seen some people do a high bar squat, and when they fail, their knees have not moved an inch backwards. And that is pretty different, right? So I think it ultimately comes down to like the mechanics that are leading to the failure of a repetition. I think if you're going to have a safe bet on what is going to provide the most directed stimulus to the muscle, it's probably machines, just because you can take some of the guesswork out of it. But you can it ultimately just depends how you're defining the task too, right? Like if I cut that low bar squat set before my knees went backwards like that, you can make a different argument there, and like how I would accumulate volume with that exercise, etc. Like there's a lot of layers of that question that make me not entirely sure like what angle they're asking from that would make my answer maybe slightly different. But if you're, if it's like a lightning round question, like yes, no, machines good for hypertrophy ? I'm probably in favor of machines, like a good amount for logistical reasons more so than mechanistic reasons. Just because I think it just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. Like we talked a little bit before we got started. Like I mostly come from the strength perspective, although I'm very interested in hypertrophy and that for its own sake. But from a strength perspective, like hypertrophy is obviously a very important component still. And so when I'm programming for a strength athlete, I do favor machines a lot of the time for hypertrophy oriented accessory exercises or whatever, because a lot of the time they have, dominant muscle groups that are going to change the way they execute the competition task in a specific way. And so when I go to a hypertrophy movement that has a very specific intent, it just takes the guesswork out of that. And I know that's what's going to be the limiting factor. So you could use that as kind of a cross argument for, physique athletes to say a similar thing of like, this is going to make sure that I train XYZ, and that's the goal, and that's going to be the limiting factor, and that's what I'm going to get really close to failure. So I could see it from a logistical perspective. Again, from a mechanistic perspective, I think pretty much all the evidence suggests that it doesn't really seem to matter. And so it would just be one of those things where, if it changes the situation considerably, then maybe it does matter. But from a purely conceptual basis, I don't think I have a super strong opinion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, forgive me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of the literature on kind of failure training, or this kind of when they're comparing, it's on like Smith machines. So it's like a little bit easier. A lot of the
velocity loss literature for sure is definitely on Smith machines. So like, I would trying to think. There's a good amount of free weight squat and bench as well, but it's a good amount of machines as well. So that definitely probably plays a role, from a practical perspective on what muscles were measured with the ultrasound, or other muscle size technique, whatever it was, and how many degrees of freedom are there in the movement to shift where the load's placed, right? So that definitely probably plays a role to some capacity. It just kind of comes from the framing in which you're kind of coming the question that would maybe change my answer slightly, but yeah.
And I think it's kind of like you said there, I've like pigeonholed you, and I hate these questions where someone's like, oh, what's better, a hack squat or like a barbell back squat? And I'm like, well, if you were to just ask me that isolated one question, I could have an answer for you, but it's not very helpful because you have a whole program that you've built out. So if you are doing like a free weight movement where, I don't know, the quads haven't gone, you only hit actually 2 RIR. You thought you technically were at 0 RIR, but the quads had more in them. You go to the leg extension, you make up some volume through that. Like you kind of get that stimulus that we're aiming for by the end. So I think this all can become...
Your experience is irrelevant, Steve. Doesn't matter. Yes or no?
Yeah, exactly. I'm kind of just elucidating that because I think sometimes people can get really lost in those like isolated questions again, like failure versus not failure, or like this versus this. It's like, well, when you peel it all back, as long as you've got like a well thought out overall program, like you're progressively overloading, you're training hard, like you're the muscles you're trying to hit are getting hit, you feel like they're being worked, like to a large extent, like, you can't be very confident in just those things if you're not experienced. But once you are quite experienced, you probably can be pretty confident that you're doing a very good job. Yeah,
I'm a big analogy guy. This may absolutely not work, but I'm gonna try it. I view the programming process more like a recipe, and like asking what's more important for a nice burger, the lettuce or the tomato, like that doesn't even really make sense. Like that question is kind of impossible to answer. It's not a burger if it doesn't have all the fixing on it. Well, you may not like lettuce or tomato, and if you don't, you're wrong. But
need a gherkin.
But yeah, that's kind of the way that I view it, is like those questions are essentially impossible to answer because it's an entire recipe and all the components are intermingled, and it's kind of impossible to describe the overall thing without, every single component underlying it. Yeah.
So well said. Yeah, Zac, this has been a really, really cool chat. I feel like I could talk about this like all day to you. And like I said, off air, and hopefully Martin will come back on and maybe we can do like a 3-way chat. I think that would be really, really cool and a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time. I'll make sure that the paper is linked in the description so people can like have full access, have a read over that, maybe have it alongside them as we've, especially at the beginning when we were going through all of that. But if people want to learn more from you, keep up to date with the work you're doing, where's the best place they should head?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, Steve, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the chat. Like I said, yeah, I enjoy getting, people that are really experienced, their questions and their thoughts and their experience kind of integrated into how they interpreted things, because I think not only does that, make me realize where we, maybe could have done a little bit better of a job describing our results and interpreting things, et cetera, but it also gives you a really good kind of understanding, like where do we need to go next. And I think that is important for everybody to keep in mind. Like, there's never the last analysis, right? Like there's always more to be done. So don't take this as the end all be all. But yeah, with that said, and again, thank you. You can pretty much find everything I do and what we do at Data Driven Strength at my Instagram link tree. You can just go to zac.datadrivenstrength on Instagram, and you can hit the link in the bio and find all our stuff there. And like you said, the paper hopefully is linked in the show notes, and you can kind of check that out and read through it and hopefully get a little bit more context. And I think the sound bites and the Instagram posts, I'm guilty of that too. Try to do my best to digest it for social media, but that can always only explain so much. So yeah, can't thank you enough. And thanks for the chat. I really enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Zac, and thank you guys for listening. Definitely check out the paper. Definitely check out Zac and Data Driven Strength. I can recommend their social media content. It's like very well done, really nicely explained, and lots to learn. And like you said, you can learn a bit there, but we've talked about this for an hour and a half and probably can talk about it more. And the sound bites, I don't know, they take about 10 minutes to digest. So yeah, there's only so much you can learn there. So yeah, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll catch you next time. Take care.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.